nature is not driven on control. Control always takes more resources than it needs to hold it in place. Always. People, money, time, attention. That's what's necessary for control. And when you shift from control to unleash, but unleash with supportive structure, like form always follows function. So purpose is the organizing framework for designing what you're doing and what you're not doing, what you need to let go of, what you need to add. You're always trying to follow your purpose. And the other thing is that this idea of scarcity, we have an economic model that is really built on extraction. We're digging resources and harvesting resources, natural and otherwise, at a rate that can't be regenerated. And exploitation, which is, we've created these systems where benefits and burdens are not equally shared.
All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the All Innovation, the AI podcast. I am Keenan Hart, your host. And of course, I'm always here joined by my handy dandy co-host, Mr. Dante McLean. Guys, welcome to the show. Today's going to be an amazing conversation because we have Dr. Kathleen Allen here with us today, who's going to be teaching us about some incredibly important stuff, but more importantly, what lessons can we learn from nature about the structure of our organizations and so much more. Dr. Allen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Allen, before we kind of get started here today, I think it's really important for us to ask, how did you stumble upon this amazing area of work? We're waiting to learn so much more from you about the connection between nature and the work that we do every single day. And having you here is going to be an amazing conversation. But how did you kind of get into this work in the first place?
Well, before we bought everything on Kindle and ebooks and whatnot, I used to love to go to a bookstore every week. And I would browse the bookshelves. And sometimes in the business and leadership section of the bookstore, there would be books that would seem to leap off the shelf, and I would have to get it. And I ran into Jeannie Benyus's book called Biomimicry, and it was one of those books. We all have names of great books that have kind of changed the whole way we think. And this is what it did. It did this for me. And while biomimicry at that time was really looking at how do we bring biologists and engineers together in nature to learn how to do things differently, like, the enzyme of an insect's wings in the Amazon to use on windows that will slough off dirt, for example. That's what they were up to. But my world has always been in the human dynamics of organizations and leadership. And so I started playing with these design ideas in nature and applying them to my work, my consulting work in organizations. I've always been in the business of change and leadership and innovation and kind of hung out at that edge of things. And I started bringing these ideas into human organizations and found they were extraordinarily powerful, not just for me, but for everybody else I was working with.
See, part of the All Innovation podcast is thinking about what innovation truly means, right? We're in a time in history right now where everybody thinks innovation means technology, artificial intelligence, apps, the internet. But we have so many lessons to learn from nature and how we can just apply the proven formulas and frameworks for how we already do things and then apply them to this digital world that we think is changing so quickly and have so many improvements, which is an amazing duality, which I think about a lot since our first conversation.
Yes. And one of the beautiful things about nature is that it innovates all the time. It experiments, and then it only replicates what works. So think about that in our organization's culture. Do we have so many experiments going on at the same time that are driving the future of our work? Or are we trying to figure out a structure and a leadership accountability framework to make people innovate? I mean, it's kind of crazy. We have nature doing this as a natural event, coming from all kinds of places. And in organizations, we're setting up goals and objectives to make that happen.
I think it's so powerful combining the idea of nature, which is, evolved over billions of years in business and business leadership. For those who, this is a very novel idea when I first heard it. For those who really want to ground this idea, like how do business organizations and leaders really conceptualize this topic? Like how do they bring it down to reality and start to grasp it within their own organization?
Well, I start big and I'll go down to the details of day-to-day work, but at the highest level, we're trying to figure out how do we build regenerative systems into the future. And regenerative systems are going to require us to let go of a lot of ways we've been taught to lead and manage and structure organizations. And the best model that we can study is nature. Nature it's the longest running regenerative system we have to study from. 3.8 billion years, and nature is still with us. We've gone through 5, some people think 5.5 mass extinctions, and we still have life on this planet. So it's designed to regenerate. And when you think about innovation, why do we innovate? We innovate so we can adapt and be relevant as the world around us changes. And if we're not, and why is it so difficult to do? Well, it's difficult to do because we've created structures, management, and leadership frameworks that have actually hindered our ability to experiment rather than help. So nature is a beautiful teacher.
When it comes to the 25 years of time that you've been studying, right, these nature-inspired leadership, organizational design, well, I want to take us back to the very origin of this. When you stumble across biomimicry, right, and you start taking this into the application of the professional world and the work that we do, and you start talking about these ideas, what type of mindset are you met with from leaders who you're talking about the similarities between nature and the organizational structures that we represent? What are some of those early conversations like?
I pair biomimicry and nature's design with the framework of thinking about our organizations as living systems. And when you think about an organization, it's filled with human beings and we're all alive. So why would we think that a mechanistic frame would give us a better explanationary power to understand the dynamics of our organization? And yet, most of us still have organizations that are designed like machines. We run people until they're exhausted or burnt out, because we just think that, if you have too much work to do and not enough time, you should just put your head down and work harder, work longer, work more. And I think this whole idea of cycles or rest or creative times or innovative times, we just don't even have the rhythm using a mechanistic frame. So living systems have rhythms. They have times when they are exploring and times when they're launching and times when they're learning how to sustain things and times of release. So you can reinvest all of that into the exploration of the next adaptive cycle. So there's so much, but what I have found is with the people that I work with, so I do a lot of organizational change work, is that with people, if they believe that they are seen as human beings, as part of a living system, the resistance that we normally experience as we need to move this part, we need to change this part, you are a cog in the wheel, that kind of resistance disappears entirely. And people start leaning in and they start getting excited and they start thinking about things differently. Now, I have to admit that most of the CEOs that I work with are already trying to figure out another way. They already know that the world is too complex for their frameworks of management that they've been brought up with. And so they are seeking. And I'm one of those lucky people that when they start asking that question, they come find me.
Man, I love this conversation so much. I remember, so I came from a background in paid ads. I'm in part of paid advertising. There's a ton of testing that needs to be done. And one day I thought to to introduce sort of like selection theory, where I create ton of ads, hundreds and hundreds of ads, and I kind of pictured them as like sea turtles, right? Because the process of a sea turtle, a lot of them don't make it. It's like 1 in 1,000 or something like that. And I was like, most of my ads don't make it, unfortunately, but the ones that do, are the ones that you get all the growth from. And so I love that process so much. And if this idea really grounds it for me, I'm curious, what are some of the successes that you've seen talking to, these new age CEOs who want to adopt these frameworks and move toward this more nature-based way of leadership and organizational change?
There is a journey that's attached to it. One is, so here are a couple of the phases. One is they're intrigued. But even before the intrigue, like how do I explore and experiment, comes a realization that the level of complexity that they're dealing with day to day in their organization's lives requires more than one leader at the top of the system. So we had this old kind of image of a leader in a hierarchical system climbing the mountain, getting up to the peak and having a 360-degree view. And they would be able to see the whole landscape and look down to the rest of us kind of scattered down the hill, down the mountain, and say, okay, we're going to go left, or we're going to go right, or this storm is on the horizon. And the thing is that most leaders today are not experiencing anything like that. The fact is that whether we like it or not, all hierarchies have networks as a secondary structure that works, and the networks are flatter. They don't have mountaintops where one person can see the whole system. They require an integration of points of view based on where you sit in the system in order to understand the whole. That changes hierarchy completely. So the folks that I worked with were beginning to experiment with holding hierarchy lightly instead of tightly. And they were trying to figure out, how do we create distributed leadership so we unleash the talent that we have in our organization instead of try to control it. And part of that unleashing requires that every single person sitting in a different place in the network share what they see in order for us to understand the whole. And that changes. So in the second phase, this framework of leadership from hierarchy to network and distributed. And then how do we develop our folks so that they don't sit around, wait to be told and ask what to do, but actually start engaging and unleashing their creative point of view based on where they sit. And they start making changes organically that make the organization more resilient.
I'm hearing a lot of similarities in this conversation between a lot of the criticisms that we hear from, I would say, legacy leaders and organizations that are structured in this hierarchical nature compared to Gen Z, who's coming into the workforce, who wants to be seen, validated, heard, and appreciated for their perspective in their area of the organization. So it seems like we're almost getting back to nature with the generation who's pushing this stuff forward. Do you ever make those connections in your mind?
Absolutely. And the idea that you have some people count and some people don't count in an organization, or it just doesn't work with where people are evolving. And I think our Gen Z, for example, kind of see the world differently. They grew up in a different time. They're digital natives. They're not digital immigrants. And they are, most of them have experience diversity in a totally different way. So there's a different kind of respect and a different kind of seeking as opposed to resisting energy. And so they in particular are very excited. So like on my Google Analytics, I have a huge following of Gen Z folks because they're resonating with these ideas.
Dr. Allen's a prophet for the next generation of work. You know what I mean? The cool thing about, and deservedly so, though. You know what I mean? Like, let's get us back to the roots, literally, of the work that we've been doing for generations and millennia of time. There was an example of a flat organization, which I really think is important to bring into the conversation here today, because we're talking about all innovation. There was, in our previous conversation, Dr. Allen, I used the example of a fireworks going off. I used the example of a Tesla engineer who was working on the factory floor installing battery packs and saw something in his assembly process that he knew he could change. And Dante, in the input of the change of how they assembled the battery pack, they were able to get like 18% quicker charging through the battery pack. Now, normally in a standard, let's call it like late 90s, early 2000s manufacturing plant like Ford or GM, you'd have to go talk to your line boss, who would then bring it up in a meeting, and they would take it to the higher ups, and they would take it to somebody who could implement that change. We're talking like months worth of delays and meetings and time. But at Tesla, what happened is that engineer took that to his managing boss, who went directly to Elon, and within 3 hours, they made those changes to the assembly line to get quicker charging out of those battery packs. A perfect example of a flat organization being able to skip the hierarchical, I would say, jump rope game that we have to play to implement change, which is so impactful. And I really wanted to ground that in a real use case example that's coming from my mind.
Yeah, I think there's lots of that kind of energy that when you have a really healthy organization that has stopped trying to control people and started to unleash people, then more and more of those examples show up. People feel like they have, okay, context matters. This is what I see. I think I can tweak this and it will be better. You still have to figure out, how is it that you integrate these ideas and these shifts and these ways of thinking? Because in complex systems, the more people just focus on their part of the organization and not the larger purpose of what they're trying to do together, they can create these innovations in a way that hinders what you're trying to do together.
Let's double click on that, Dr. Allen, really quick. So you say when we focus in our own silos and we innovate without a full picture of the organization and the impact that we're making, we could actually be innovating to create more complexities which slow down the entire organization rather than from a holistic view, correct?
Yes.
That's really interesting to me.
This is another lesson from nature. So if nature doesn't really have a CEO hanging around, there's no Elon Musk in nature, right? But it does two things to create something extraordinary. One, it has a very strong embedded purpose that is shared by all living entities in nature, whether it's a blade of grass, an ant, a bee, a wolf, a beaver, it doesn't matter. And that kind of deep, powerful organizing purpose is that nature is designed to create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. Yeah. It's designed to regenerate. It's designed to ensure life continues. That's the purpose. And then nature, in its infinite wisdom, unleashes self-organization. So everything self-organizes. When we want to make a hard surface, we beat, treat, or heat the steel into, tempered steel or ceramics. But nature self-assembles at the molecular level to create things like the abalone shell that is per square inch as hard as anything that we make, beating, heating, and treating. So self-organization is actually how they unleash this kind of highly innovative experimental environment. So they unleash self-organization and they organize around a shared purpose that is very powerful. And then everything serves the purpose. That's how nature holds the whole. But we don't really do that very well in human organizations. We tend to think about mission, vision, and values as kind of our framework to create purpose, but purpose doesn't exist within the boundaries of the organization. Purpose exists in the space between the organization and the larger community. So the way you find purpose is you say, what's the deep need that our organization is uniquely positioned to meet? And then that's where you begin to figure out your purpose. I do a lot of work with senior teams, and a lot of times they just really don't understand their purpose. They think of themselves as representing their division. And it's a representative leadership frame or a hierarchical serve the CEO kind of frame. But when you ask the question, what's the deep need that the organization has that the leadership team is uniquely positioned to respond to, then you get to a deeper question of who are you there to serve and why, and what do you do as a result of that? And it changes the self-interest to enlightened self-interest and eventually organizes it around purpose, just like nature.
Do you think we start with purpose to get there? So I kind of think of this as we talk to a lot of leaders and about different things around innovation. It's always, we have one group that's for innovation and one group that's afraid of change, right? And then I kind of think of it as like we have the thesis and antithesis, and they battle it out until we create a new thesis over time. And that's kind of what we see in nature, right? Over time. I'm curious how you think of leaders adopting this change and how that organizational change happens. Is it just deeply understanding purpose and realigning the team's values and how they perceive themselves within the roles of the company, or is there something deeper?
There is something deeper and more. So when we start with the assumption that our organizations are machine, all change starts with the assumption that the organization is static and standing still. Living systems are always in movement. So when you try to create change in a static system, you have to have somebody who's going to drive the change. You have to have somebody who's going to some kind of energy, leadership, power to start the change, to initiate the change, to keep it going. And it's a huge time suck, actually. Energy, resources, staffing go into starting the change and holding the change and getting to the end of the change. But in nature, it is a naturally changing system. It is not static. So if you think your organization is a living system, then what you need to do is to see the movement that's already there. So instead of trying to change someone or something, you basically look and say, okay, where is this energy already existing in the organization? And then how do we connect it to the rest of the organization? How do we disseminate these great ideas that are happening in one part of the ecosystem so it connects to the rest? So I always think that we're changing our leadership questions. So instead of in a static system, who's going to make it happen? In a living system, you ask what interactions will make this work, because it's an interdependent system. And if you get the right people in the room, something really interesting happens. Instead of how do I overcome resistance, a living system understands that resistance is necessary for wholeness. Yeah. And you can't understand the system without also inviting resistance into it to understand those tensions. So tensions can be promising, and they exist all the time in a living system. Instead of trying to, kind of change things on an individual level, you're really trying to change things on the level of a field. It's like field theory, like the field of gravity, magnetic fields. You're trying to understand the hidden things that drive us and move us that are just normal in living systems. And instead of trying to start change, you're trying to transform the energy that's already there. Here's a connection between self-organization and change. So what do we think of ourselves in partnership when we do change? So I now think change is actually about growing change in a living system than making change. So when you think about a seed in your garden, what do? We prepare the soil. We select the seeds we want to plant. But then nothing happens that we can see. We water it, but the seed already knows how to germinate. It's already actively partnering with us. And maybe a week later, there's a little green shoot that comes up out of the soil. The seed has germinated without our ability to see, but then it knows how to grow. Our job is to provide nutrients. But growth also comes with time delays. And this is another thing that if you think you're a machine driving change through the organization, we never allow time delays so people can adjust and change the way they think in relationship to change or innovation. So when you grow change, you know that there's a time delay between planting the seed and harvesting the fruit. And that there's a process that helps you. And living systems help us begin to think differently about how we treat people, how we work with people, how we partner with people. Nature is an interdependent system, and so I think all change, all innovation flows through people at the speed of trust. And Hewlett-Packard actually has some great research on this. In the late 90s, the inkjet division up in Seattle was playing around with social networks and what do social networks have to do with innovation. So basically they found that when everybody is equal, the innovation and the creative energy for changing and creating an innovation is a very kind of organic flow that happens. So everybody's on the same level. Everybody is actively listening and contributing, and then something magical happens and something new emerges. But if you put a decision maker, hierarchy, power position person in that room, and they show up in that way, it will shut down the innovation completely. But you also have social networks that are hierarchical. And that's where, once the innovation has happened in this flat, collaborative kind of skunkworks, then you need to have somebody that says, yeah, we're going to do this. And then there's a third network, social network called distributed or disseminating network. And that's how you spread the innovation through your system or into the wider world. But that's nature would see. That would be a fairly normal thing for nature to think about. Only in mechanistic ways do we stop thinking that way.
Just hearing you break these things down seems so natural. I use that word in kind of like an intentionality of a pun, right? It's just like if we get back to the basics, everything seems to make way more sense. Mm-hmm. So do you start to worry about our ability to perceive the natural world and the efficiencies that it literally hands to us on a daily basis when we are surrounded by so much digital technology and we're almost being trained, if you will, slowly but surely by these devices in our hands to expect things to happen quickly? We don't have the patience to give things time. We're always taught that there needs to be a top dog. So everything that this digital world is teaching us is in direct contrast with everything that we're talking about here today.
Yes, and here's the nuance. So digital technology is actually built on an interdependent frame. So you can't, just think about the number of interfaces that your device and all of its apps have. It assumes interdependence at its core. So in that way, the technology world and the natural world have similarities. They're both based in interdependence. But technology also has a strong kind of mechanistic frame. It is a machine, and so these ideas of no time delays, instant response, it gives us no time to slow down, it gives us no time to reflect. It tends to create a hyperactive activity culture instead of impact or productivity culture. Cal Newport, in his slow productivity guy, he's an example of, humans create in a different pace and speed, and how do we create spaces for that to happen in our organizations? They ask us deeper questions.
I mean, just to reference back to Cal Newport, in our previous conversation, Dante, we were talking about, the topic of deep work, right? Mm-hmm. And the topic of deep work, as articulated by Cal Newport, is the elimination of distractions, but also giving us the time to be able to focus and allow for these natural, I would say, moments of inspiration to come to us. When we're constantly distracted, thinking we need to be busier to be more productive, it almost seems like we're not letting the apple tree grow to harvest. Every single time we see the green stalk, we're grabbing at the leaves and we're eating it really quick and being like, this isn't nearly as satiating as an entire apple is, but we just didn't give it time. You know what I mean? It's an interesting world that we're living in. I feel like we're all getting caught in this digital trap, if you will, to do more, but sometimes doing less is actually doing more.
In fact, nature as a design principle only uses the energy it needs to accomplish any task. So now I am asking in my consulting practice, what's the smallest thing we can do to create the highest possible impact? Because that's a nature frame. That's not a human frame. Our human frame is we tend to create complex plans, pages and pages and pages of, documents on how we're going to move from A to Z. And we throw a lot of resources, a lot of positional power, and we don't create a totally different possible outcome, which is you just use the interdependence that's already there. You nudge the system, you watch the dynamics that show up, and then you flow along those in lines of energy and relationship. And then you can do a lot with almost nothing at all.
Dr. Allen, I'd love for you to talk about the mycelium experiment. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah,
in Tokyo?
mycelium is great.
Yeah, could you tell us a story about that and why you feel that just the natural process of nature is so efficient?
So mycelium is a fungi that basically exists underneath the forest floor. So the root structure of myceliums, which are small, mushroom-like fungus. If you just think about putting your foot down on the forest floor, underneath that foot, the footprint literally would be about 300 miles of connection.
Wow.
I know. It's totally mind-blowing. So mycelium has three roles in a forest ecology. One is it connects plants and trees to each other. The second is it communicates, and communication flows through this network. And the third is that it shares nutrients. So if you have the pine borer, kind of attacking a tree somewhere in the distance of the forest ecology, the mycelium would actually share that information, and resources and nutrients could share back to increase the resilience of the tree that is being attacked by a virus or something like that. Oftentimes in a forest, highly canopied forest, the mother tree actually, because the canopy is completely full, one of the reasons why young trees can continue to grow is that their root structure and the mycelium share resources to newer trees, and so they can continue to grow without the framework of the canopy. In fact, this is a beautiful story about slow productivity, is that trees in a highly canopied forest grow thin, and they grow to about 5 to 8 feet tall, but they don't grow very wide because the sunlight, which helps build photosynthesis resources, just aren't enough for them to really grow tall. And so what happens is they're amplified and supported by additional resources coming through mycelium and root structures. But eventually what happens is maybe there's wind shear or something, and there's an opening in the canopy. And so they grow slow, and then something opens up and the sunlight shows up. It takes a couple of decades for it to close off again, and they jump up another 10, 20 feet, and then they slow down again. The initial phase of slow growth is that it develops the heartwood of the tree, which is the deep, strong core of the tree. And then as these experiences with the canopy opening up. Then they grow fast for a while, and then they slow down, gather their resources again, and wait. And then they do it until they're part of the canopy. But we don't think about developing people that way, that they maybe have to develop an inner core before they can, develop their external work. But nature does.
Is there a best practice equation? Because earlier in the conversation, we talked about there's a season, I'll use that word, for innovation. There's a season for launching. There's a season for recovery. Is there a best practice equation that nature has already laid out for us to be most effective in change? Of course there is.
Yeah. This is called the adaptive cycle, or sometimes they call it the panarchy. So the idea is that for 3.8 billion years, we have kind of a infinity loop on its side that is basically the structure of how nature continues to adapt as changing times occur. And nature always sees itself in relationship to what's going on in the external environment. In that way, business, it might be predisposed to pay attention to this. We have institutions that cycle fast with feedback with changing environments. And we also have institutions that are slow cycles. Our politics tend to be the slowest cycle. You'd think they'd be faster with elections happening at a certain pace, but in fact, they tend to be the last ones to change around innovation. But business and technology tend to be the fastest cyclers, in part because they're paying attention to what's going on. But this adaptive cycle is literally this kind of explore, discover, posit possibilities, see what is possible in the new system. And then there's this launching experimental phase, throw a lot of experiments at it, see what works. Then there's a sustaining frame, and then there's a release. And then you reuse the energy that had been locked up in sustaining to build your next cycle. So nature has been operating that way for billions of years. Human systems, we stop this adaptive cycle two ways. One, between the explore and launch phase. If we have too much of a framework of scarcity, we fail to launch. We fail to invest. And the other place is between the sustain and release. When we get too caught up in the what we're trying to sustain, holding too tightly. I mean, close your fist and think about the energy it takes to hold that fist versus an open hand that we have. Too much rigidity in the system basically is the sign that it's going to collapse. That's what nature would teach us. So I now, when I walk into organizations, I ask, where are we failing to invest? And the second place is, where are we too rigid? Which means that we're about ready, our business model is about ready to collapse, and we're holding on too tight to the old.
Wow. That's powerful.
I'm really interested in the dichotomy between the scarcity and abundance mindset. Now, recognizing that nature only uses the amount of energy that's necessary to complete the next phase, we're not looking to gobble up additional resources. It seems like we've gone to the exact opposite way in which we approach business. A lot of people don't make innovative changes unless they have a plethora of additional resources that they can then leverage at an opportunity. Do you think that there's a little bit of a miscalculation of the amount of abundance that's needed to actually adapt and innovate when it comes to how we work with business?
So this is another lesson from nature, because nature is not driven on control. Control always takes more resources than it needs to hold it in place. Always. People, money, time, attention, that's what's necessary for control. And when you shift from control to unleash, but unleash with supportive structure, like form always follows function. So purpose is the organizing framework for designing what you're doing and what you're not doing, what you need to let go of, what you need to add. You're always trying to follow your purpose. And the other thing is that this idea of uh, scarcity, we have an economic model that is really built on extraction. We're digging resources and harvesting resources, natural and otherwise, at a rate that can't be regenerated. And exploitation, which is we've created these systems where benefits and burdens are not equally shared. So the way we do that is we exploit people in the workplace so that the profits can be unequally distributed, which then drives a kind of a enclosure of wealth and power in the system as its purpose, right? But in a regenerative system in nature, it actually becomes more generous the more it evolves. And it becomes more diverse the more it evolves. So the diversity actually is the nature rewards cooperation, but it banks on diversity. So as diversity increases in a natural system, it can turn into something called a generous system. So old growth forests become more generous rather than more scarce, because when you have more different species in the ecosystem, they start sharing resources across species to provide nutrients for them to thrive. And that's what starts creating abundance.
I'm curious your take on this. I've been kind of mulling over this question during our conversation, and you indulge me because it's kind of like a philosophical question. So you talked a little bit about the mycelium, and it grows slowly through time. And it really just, I get the sense that nature is not in a rush. Everything happens through time. But and when we think about humans and human nature, we're in such a rush for everything to be done. And some of these principles we seem like almost like separated from when we look at our culture today. And I started asking myself why. And do you feel that like maybe our acute awareness of our own mortality and maybe nature's unawareness of mortality may be driving some of this separation that we feel from nature?
Oh, I love that question.
That was a very Dante question right there. That was perfect.
Well, first of all, nature has lots of different speeds at which it moves change. So it can be very quick, like a 3-month summer explosion of weeds and that eventually die off and don't come back. But they do add fertilizer, so to speak, to the soil that then over time allows for the next generation of plants and that ecosystem to show up. But it also creates change over centuries and millennia. And so you have all of these different levels of speed. But I think your deeper interesting question is, how do humans' emotions and fears shape our actions today? What is it that, because I think nature doesn't really have emotions in the way humans do. And nature operates more on instinct rather than on emotions. And there are two ways that we interfere with nature's lessons in organizations. And one is our emotions, fear in particular. And then the emotions also shape our defenses that we create. So we have a consciousness that is different, that's attached to language, that is different than we find in nature, although there's lots of communication going on there. But we can rationalize our way out of things that are good for us. We can rationalize our way out of feedback that we should be listening to, and we can ignore it. And so it's our emotions and our consciousness that actually get in the way of really seeing how nature is different. And it's, I think, our fear that sometimes causes us not to really see the deep connectivity that we have in ourselves and the world around us. The indigenous tribes, who are very place-based over hundreds and sometimes even thousands of years, they know their place. They know the people in their community. They know the nature around them. They know the animals that exist in that ecology. They have a relationship because of that connectivity, that they only harvest what they need, as opposed to, let's cut the whole forest down and see where it takes us, because we can sell that wood, and these individuals who are in the decision making can make a lot of money. Nature always sees 7 generations minimally ahead, and we don't.
I mean, if you think about that, I want to double click on that a little bit, right? If you come from a culture that is grounded in connection to nature, you're also grounded in the realization that everything is cyclical, right? Death is a guarantee. And when I think about kind of the way in which we live our lives, we all recognize when we are born that there is one thing that is guaranteed. It's not even taxes. It is death at the end of our lives. But yet we never really talk about those type of topics. And it seems like we create this facade or this, illusion that in order to be busy and to make a life that is fulfilling, we need to rush to get through things because we secretly know that we have that timeline in the back of our head. It just seems very unnatural to ignore the guaranteed things in life. And that also forms the decisions that we make as well, which is a really interesting timeline to kind of create in our mind, which is interesting to me.
And, what is it that, what if, we have a bunch of things that we need to let go of, ways of thinking that we need to let go of in order to move and transform ourselves towards something that's maybe more regenerative as an economy, for example. And yet we hold on, and sometimes we're not even conscious of those habits that no longer serve us. This would be another beautiful lesson from nature, that nature evolves, it doesn't change. And so every act, every shift, every movement is designed to move towards an evolution, to a more complex, interdependent state. And so now I start thinking about individuals and nature's evolution and organizations' evolution. And then I ask the question, okay, so what is it that, how do natural systems evolve? Well, they evolve with information and they evolve with feedback. So there's this concept called Keystone species in an ecology, like the wolves in Yellowstone. And wolves, but beavers, it's not just big, but it's really about their role that they play in the ecology. And Yellowstone gave us a beautiful study of what happens when the wolves became extinct in Yellowstone, and then what happened when they came back. And their unique role as a keystone species is to give feedback to curb excess from within the system. And when they do that, they create more resilient and more diverse ecologies. That's the role of a keystone species. It's not to be...
For those listening, Dr. Allen, who aren't aware what happened in Yellowstone, what's the story?
So the story is that after 70 years of the wolves being extinct, the park was becoming less and less resilient. And the elks and the deers had moved out of their natural grazing patterns into the valleys, and they had started, eating the trees, so the trees couldn't grow as they normally would, which then took the habitat of the birds of prey out of the park, and they moved elsewhere. The root systems of the trees weren't strong enough to hold the banks of the river, and so the rivers actually became less, kind of stable. The beavers left. They're the engineers of the waterways that create greater diversity in the waterways. They overgrazed the grasslands, and so the wolves and the mice and the fox and other kinds of relationships that our species have with each other they disappeared. And so then they were studying, they reintroduced 12 pairs, mated pairs, 70 years later, and then they watched what happened, and they stabilized the streams and the waterways because the trees were no longer being overeaten, and they grew 5 times within the first 3 years, and that brought the birds back. And And then the grasses that were in those valley areas were able to recover, and that invited a better habitat for small prairie dogs and mice, and that brought the wolves back. And when the river stabilized, the beavers came back, and they created an environment for otters and fish. And so it was a story about how wolves changed the rivers in the Yellowstone. There's a great video on that by that time.
Wow. So here's the thing that I think we should talk about a little bit, which is kind of the essence of human connection and why it's so important. In 2022, the Surgeon General came onto a national broadcast, the first time since like the 1960s, where he was giving a broadcast about the dangers of cigarette smoke. So the biggest threat to the American society today in 2022 is not another viral pandemic, but an epidemic of isolation and loneliness. Do we believe, from your perspective and grounded understanding of how these naturistic systems impact our work and lives, do we really believe that a sustainable way in the future is working in a remote, isolated place while trying to be a part of a team with all this digital connection that we have here today? Or is this just a fallacy that we're kind of leaning into at this point in time?
I think we could be in between. We could be in a phase towards something else. This is what evolution is always like. We sometimes look at where we are and we assume this is the end of our evolution, as opposed to we're midway through. And so we don't know what technology will do to us that will bring us back into relationship in a physical way that may be a three-dimensional virtual interaction. But in nature, and I believe in people as well, we are literally predisposed to reach out to each other. And we're better in connection than we are in separation. And and this actually goes to neurotransmitters and hormones. In the ocean ecology, it goes back. It was imprinted in every species in the ocean ecology in a neurotransmission hormone chemical way to be drawn to each other. And so the ocean is filled with partnerships across species that last a lifetime in ways that allow for both species to thrive. And yet here we are, kind of thinking we're all alone. See, I think this comes in part from the misquote of Darwin's research. So people got really excited about Darwin, but they misquoted his research to say it was about the survival of the fittest. And I think that created this whole line of thought that being selfish and serving yourself alone was kind of part of survival, of my own individual survival or my family's survival. But actually, Darwin's research says it's survival of the best fit. So it's the person and the people and the communities that have the best, that can evolve and adapt to changes in the environment, that survive. And when you go to survival of the best fit, then things like learning, connection, feedback, information, they help us evolve, and that's a collective thing. Information can reside in technology, but collective intelligence emerges out of conversation with people.
This has been an amazing conversation, Dr. Allen. It's not too often that Dante and I can just sit here in awe and just listen to somebody on the podcast, just continue to just drop bomb after bomb and knowledge bomb after knowledge bomb. But, just even listening to the simplicity of this message, right? There's an undercurrent, if you will, of let's just go back to the before times where we weren't trying to overcomplicate these systems as human beings to get the results that we're looking for. I want to give you the last couple minutes here to talk about how people can find more information from you. What type of things where they can interact with you through books or blog posts or a website or something like that, where people can kind of tap into, this amazing wisdom that you're dropping here for us today?
Well, I write a weekly blog that is really designed to enhance and tell stories of this interface between organizations and nature's lessons and leadership and innovation. So they can sign up for my blog at kathleenallen.net. all one word, KathleenAllen.net, and that will give you a kind of a weekly little infusion of ideas. You know, a 3-minute read that will give you a weekly infusion of the evolution of my thinking. I wrote a book called Leading from the Roots that is kind of unpacks nature's design and living systems, and what is it that what's the lesson from nature, and then what is it that we have to let go of, and what is it that we have to embrace in the way we think about leadership and organization structure and processes. And then in early next year, I'll have a small ebook that will be coming out called Following Nature's Lead, and that will be kind of a fun series of short ideas on things like interdependence and how do we redefine profit in a natural system and things like that. And then you can follow me on LinkedIn as Kathy Allen.
Everybody go down to the description, look at all of these different opportunities for you to engage with Dr. Allen. Just an amazing opportunity for us to be able to share your story and how innovation should be rooted right in nature if we really want to do things as effectively as we possibly can. Dante, why don't you kind of close us out here, man?
And I really appreciate your time, Dr. Allen. This has been an absolute delight. Keenan told me before, we jumped on that I was going to really enjoy this conversation, and did not disappoint for sure. So look forward to staying in touch. You have a friend.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I'd love to stay in touch with you folks and see what you're doing and how you're evolving. Thank you so much.
Once again, Dr. Allen, thank you so much for coming on the show. That's a wrap. We'll catch you guys in the next one.